My son used to call me poor while I lived in a rented place. With my husband's inheritance, I bought an entire building. Days later, his wife visited me and said, "What a beautiful building. We'll love living here." Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this, and comment the city you're watching from. My name is Martha, and at 64 years old I thought I knew what pain felt like. I'd buried my husband 6 months ago, raised my son Thomas mostly alone while working 2 jobs, and survived more heartbreak than most people face in a lifetime. But nothing prepared me for the moment my own child looked me in the eye and called me poor like it was a disease. It happened at his birthday dinner last month. Thomas had turned 38, and his wife Mila insisted on celebrating at Romano's, the expensive Italian place downtown where a single meal costs more than I used to spend on groceries in a week. I should have known something was wrong when Mila suggested I sit at the far end of the table, away from Thomas's work colleagues. "Mom fits better there," she'd said with that sweet smile she reserved for public moments. "More comfortable for everyone." I watched from my corner as Thomas held court, telling stories about his promotion at the marketing firm, his new BMW, the vacation house they were considering in the Hamptons. His friends hung on every word, impressed by his success. And there I sat, invisible in my department store dress, clutching my worn purse like a security blanket. The conversation turned to real estate, as it always did with that crowd. Everyone bragged about their mortgage payments, their property values, their home renovations. I stayed quiet, stirring my soup and hoping no one would ask about my living situation. But then Derek, Thomas's college roommate, turned to me with genuine curiosity. "Mrs. Patterson, Thomas never mentions where you live. Do you have a place nearby?" The table went silent. I felt heat creep up my neck as every eye focused on me. Thomas's jaw tightened, and I could see Mila smirking behind her wine glass. "I rent a small apartment on Maple Street," I said quietly, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh," Derek said, clearly not understanding the sudden tension. "That's nice. Renting gives you flexibility." That's when Thomas laughed. Not a warm laugh, but something cold and bitter that I'd never heard from him before. "Flexibility," he repeated. "That's one way to put it." Mila leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "Martha's been renting the same tiny place for 15 years. Never could quite manage to buy anything, could you?" The words hit me like a slap. I looked at my son, waiting for him to defend me, to remind his wife that I'd sacrificed everything to give him opportunities. Instead, he shrugged and took a long sip of his expensive wine. "Some people just aren't good with money," he said, not looking at me. At least I didn't inherit that particular trait. The laughter from his friends felt like knives. I sat there, frozen, as my own son basically told everyone that my financial struggles were a character flaw he was grateful to have avoided. The worst part wasn't even his words. It was the relief in his voice, like he'd finally said something he'd been holding back for years. "Thomas," I whispered, but he was already moving on to another topic, dismissing me as easily as he would a waitress. I excused myself to the bathroom, but really I just needed to hide. Standing in that fancy restroom with its gold fixtures and marble counters, I stared at my reflection and wondered when my son had started seeing me as an embarrassment. When had my love become something he tolerated rather than treasured? The ride home was torture. Thomas drove in silence while Mila chattered about the evening, occasionally making little comments about people who live beyond their means, and how some folks never learn to plan ahead. Each word was clearly aimed at me, sitting in the back seat like a scolded child. When we pulled up to my building, a modest complex with aging brick and small windows, I heard Mila whisper to Thomas, "Thank God you got out of this cycle." I climbed out of the car, my legs shaky with humiliation. "Thank you for dinner," I managed to say. Thomas finally looked at me, and for a moment I thought I saw regret in his eyes. But then he glanced at my building and sighed. "Maybe next year you'll have figured things out, Mom." As their car pulled away, I stood on the sidewalk feeling smaller than I had since I was a child. My own son was ashamed of me. The boy I'd rocked through countless nights, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose dreams I'd supported even when it meant skipping meals. He looked at me and saw failure. I walked up to my apartment, past the neighbors who'd become like family over the years, past the little garden I'd planted by the entrance, past all the things that had made this place feel like home. For the first time I saw it through Thomas's eyes. Small, cheap, temporary. The home of someone who'd never quite made it. That night I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea, staring at the photo on my refrigerator. Thomas at his college graduation, his arm around me, both of us beaming with pride. I remembered how he'd thanked me in his speech, how he'd said none of his success would have been possible without his mother's sacrifices. When had that gratitude curdled into shame? When had my love become a burden he carried instead of a gift he treasured? I thought about calling him, trying to explain how his words had hurt me. But what could I say? That he was wrong about my finances? That there were things about our family situation he didn't understand? The truth was too complicated, too painful. Some secrets were meant to stay buried. Instead, I went to bed that night with a hollow ache in my chest, wondering if this was how the rest of my life would be, watching my son from the sidelines, grateful for whatever scraps of attention he threw my way, always apologizing for not being the mother he deserved. I had no idea that everything was about to change. That in just a few weeks, the phone would ring with news that would turn my entire world upside down. But that night, all I knew was the crushing weight of my son's disappointment, and the terrible certainty that I had somehow failed the person I loved most in this world. 3 weeks after that humiliating dinner, I was folding laundry in my small living room when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was professional, slightly formal, and completely unexpected. "Mrs. Patterson? This is James Morrison from Morrison & Associates. I was your late husband's attorney." My hands went numb, and I nearly dropped the phone. Robert had been gone for 6 months, and I thought all the legal matters had been settled. The funeral expenses, the small life insurance policy, the closing of his accounts, it had all been straightforward, or so I believed. "I'm calling because there's been a development regarding your husband's estate," Mr. Morrison continued. "Would it be possible for you to come to my office this week? There are some documents that require your immediate attention." I pressed the phone closer to my ear, my heart racing. Is something wrong? I thought everything was already taken care of. "Nothing's wrong, Mrs. Patterson. Quite the opposite, actually. But this is a conversation better had in person. How does Thursday at 2 o'clock sound?" Thursday couldn't come fast enough. I spent the intervening days imagining every possible scenario, most of them involving some kind of debt or legal complication that Robert had hidden from me. My husband had been a quiet man, methodical and private about his affairs. During our 22 years of marriage, he'd handled all the finances while I focused on raising Thomas and working my part-time jobs. Morrison & Associates occupied the 15th floor of a glass building downtown, the kind of place that screamed expensive legal fees. I felt out of place in my best dress, the same navy blue one I'd worn to Thomas's birthday dinner. As I rode the elevator up to meet whatever bad news awaited me, Mr. Morrison was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office was impressive, lined with law books and certificates, with a view of the city that must have cost extra. "Please sit down, Mrs. Patterson," he said, gesturing to a leather chair across from his desk. "Can I get you coffee? Water?" "I'm fine, thank you." I perched on the edge of the chair, my purse clutched in my lap. "You said there was something about Robert's estate?" He opened a thick manila folder and pulled out several documents. "Your husband came to see me about 2 years before his death. He wanted to set up what's called a delayed inheritance trust." I frowned. "I don't understand. Robert never mentioned anything like that to me." "He specifically requested that you not be informed until after his death. The trust was designed to mature 6 months after his passing." Mr. Morrison leaned forward, his expression serious. "Mrs. Patterson, your husband was far more financially astute than you might have realized." He slid a document across the desk. My eyes scanned the page, but the legal language might as well have been written in a foreign language. Then I saw a number that made my breath catch in my throat. "This can't be right," I whispered, staring at the figure. "There has to be a mistake." $1.7 million, Mr. Morrison said quietly. "Your husband spent years making careful investments, building a portfolio that he kept completely separate from your household accounts. He never touched this money during his lifetime. It was always meant for you." The room seemed to spin. I gripped the arms of the chair, trying to process what I was hearing. "But how? We lived so modestly. He worked at the hardware store for 30 years. We never had extra money for investments. Your husband was extraordinarily disciplined. He reinvested every penny of profit, compound interest working in his favor over decades. He also received a small inheritance from an uncle that he never mentioned. He used that as his initial seed money. Mr. Morrison pulled out another document. There's more. The trust includes specific instructions. Your husband wanted you to use this money to buy property to secure your future. He was very clear about that. I sat in stunned silence, tears streaming down my cheeks. Robert had known. Somehow, he'd known that I would need this security, this independence. All those years of watching me worry about rent, about bills, about our modest lifestyle. And he'd been quietly building me a safety net. He left a letter, Mr. Morrison said gently, handing me a sealed envelope with my name written in Robert's careful handwriting. My hand shook as I opened it. Robert's voice seemed to speak to me from the page. My dearest Martha, if you're reading this, then I'm gone and the trust has matured. I know you're probably shocked and maybe even angry that I kept this from you. But I needed to know you would be secure, that you'd never have to depend on anyone else for your dignity. You sacrificed so much for Thomas and for me. Now it's time for you to live for yourself. Buy the home you've always deserved. Be the woman I always knew you were. Strong, independent, worthy of respect. Don't let anyone make you feel small ever again. With all my love, Robert. I sobbed right there in that expensive office, not caring what Mr. Morrison thought. 22 years of marriage, and my husband had been protecting me in ways I never imagined. While I'd felt trapped by our financial limitations, he'd been quietly building my freedom. Your husband also left specific recommendations for property management companies and real estate agents, Mr. Morrison said, tactfully ignoring my tears. He researched everything thoroughly. He wanted to make this transition as smooth as possible for you. Over the next hour, we went through the paperwork. The money was real, already transferred to an account in my name. The property recommendations included several buildings in the most desirable part of the city. Not just houses, but investment properties that would provide ongoing income. As I walked out of that office, the legal documents in my purse, I felt like a different person. The same woman who'd been humiliated by her own son 3 weeks ago now had the means to buy and sell the restaurant where that dinner had taken place. But more than the money, Robert had given me something invaluable. The knowledge that someone had seen my worth when I couldn't see it myself. He believed I deserved more than a rented apartment on Maple Street. He believed I deserved respect. The drive home was surreal. I looked at my neighborhood with new eyes, seeing it not as a symbol of my limitations but as a chapter that was about to close. For the first time in months, I thought about Thomas's cruel words without feeling that familiar stab of shame. At least I didn't inherit that particular trait, he'd said, referring to what he saw as my financial failures. If only he knew what I'd actually inherited. If only he knew that his father had seen fit to trust me with wealth that exceeded anything Thomas had achieved in his marketing career. But I wasn't ready to tell him yet. First, I had some decisions to make. Some dignity to reclaim. Some respect to earn. That evening, I called the first real estate agent on Robert's list. I'd like to look at investment properties, I said, my voice steady and confident for the first time in years. I'm particularly interested in apartment buildings in the Riverside district. The agent's enthusiasm was immediate. The Riverside district was the most exclusive area in the city, where politicians and business executives lived, where Thomas had always dreamed of affording a place. As I hung up the phone, I smiled for the first time since Robert's funeral. My husband had given me more than money. He'd given me the power to rewrite my own story. And I intended to make it a story worthy of the woman he'd always believed me to be. The Riverside Gardens building stood like a monument to elegance on Prospect Avenue, its limestone facade gleaming in the afternoon sun. 12 stories of luxury apartments, each unit commanding views of the river and the city skyline beyond. When Sarah, my real estate agent, first showed me the property listing, I nearly laughed out loud. The asking price was $800,000. More money than I'd ever imagined touching, let alone spending. But Robert's letter echoed in my mind. Be the woman I always knew you were. And that woman, I decided, deserved to live somewhere beautiful. The current owner, an elderly businessman relocating to Florida, was motivated to sell quickly. Within 2 weeks of that life-changing meeting with Mr. Morrison, I found myself signing papers that made me the owner of one of the most prestigious buildings in the city. The penthouse apartment, a sprawling 3-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows and a wraparound terrace, became my new home. Moving day felt like stepping into someone else's life. Professional movers handled my modest belongings with the same care they'd give priceless antiques. My old furniture looked lost in the vast spaces, but I didn't mind. I had plans for this place. The first thing I did was hire Isabella, an interior designer recommended by Sarah. Isabella was a sophisticated woman in her 40s who treated my budget with the respect it deserved. Together, we transformed the penthouse into something Robert would have been proud of. Elegant but comfortable. Expensive but not ostentatious. "You have excellent instincts, Mrs. Patterson," Isabella said as we selected a pearl gray sectional sofa that cost more than 3 months of my old rent. "Many of my clients with new money go overboard, but you understand the difference between luxury and excess." New money. The phrase should have stung, but instead it filled me with quiet pride. Yes, this was new money, money I'd earned through decades of love and sacrifice. Money my husband had carefully cultivated as a gift for my future. There was nothing shameful about that. I also hired Pinnacle Property Management to handle the day-to-day operations of the building. The company came highly recommended and specialized in high-end residential properties. Margaret Chun, the account manager assigned to my building, was a no-nonsense woman who understood that I wanted to be an involved but not intrusive owner. "Your tenants are quality people," she assured me during our first meeting in my new dining room. "We have 2 doctors, a federal judge, 3 senior executives, and a retired ambassador. The waiting list for units here is extensive." Learning to navigate my new world required adjustments I hadn't anticipated. The concierge, Carlos, treated me with a deference I wasn't used to. The doorman, James, insisted on handling any packages personally. My neighbors nodded politely in the hallways, clearly curious about the building's new owner but too well-bred to ask direct questions. The loneliness was unexpected. In my old building, Mrs. Chun from next door would chat with me in the laundry room, and Mr. Rodriguez always asked about my day when we passed on the stairs. Here, privacy was valued above neighborly connection. I missed the simple human warmth of my former life even as I appreciated the comfort of my new one. But there were compensations. I joined the Riverside Community Association and discovered a world of cultural activities I'd never had time or money to enjoy. Art exhibitions, charity luncheons, book clubs discussing novels I'd always wanted to read but never had the leisure to purchase. Slowly, I began to build a social circle of women my age who welcomed me without knowing my history. 3 months into my new life, I was having coffee with Eleanor Whitman, a retired professor who lived 2 buildings down, when she mentioned something that made my blood run cold. "There's been quite a bit of interest in the Harrison building," she said, stirring sugar into her cup. "That beautiful pre-war structure on Elm Street? Apparently, a young couple has been trying to secure an apartment there for months." My heart stopped. The Harrison building was one of the most exclusive addresses in Riverside, known for its rigorous screening process and year-long waiting lists. "A young couple?" I managed to ask. "Yes, the wife is quite persistent, I'm told. Very eager to join our little community. She keeps emphasizing her husband's success in marketing and their financial stability. Apparently, they're quite tired of their current living situation." The description could fit any number of couples, but something in my chest told me otherwise. I excused myself early from coffee and spent the rest of the day trying to dismiss my suspicions. Thomas and Mila couldn't possibly be looking at properties in Riverside. The rent alone would be far beyond their means, wouldn't it? But the doubt gnawed at me. That evening, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since moving. I drove past my old neighborhood, parking across from the modest apartment complex where I'd lived for 15 years. The sight of my former building brought a wave of unexpected nostalgia. But more than that, it reminded me of how far I'd traveled in such a short time. As I sat there, remembering the woman I'd been just months ago, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Thomas's name. The first time he'd contacted me since that awful birthday dinner. "Hi, Mom." His voice sounded strained. "I hope I'm not calling too late." "It's fine," I said, though my heart was racing. "How are you?" "Actually, that's why I'm calling. Mila and I were wondering. We haven't heard from you in a while. We drove by your old place last week, but the landlord said you'd moved out. Did you find another apartment? The casual way he said old place stung, but I kept my voice level. Yes, I moved. I found something more suitable. Oh. He sounded surprised. Well, that's good. Where are you living now? I could have told him then. Could have given him my new address and watched his reaction when he realized his poor mother now lived in one of the most expensive buildings in the city. But something held me back. Perhaps the memory of his cruel laughter at Romano's, or maybe just the instinct to protect myself until I understood what this call was really about. I'm in Riverside, I said simply. Riverside. His voice pitched higher. Mom, that's a really expensive area. Are you sure you can afford it? There it was, the same condescending concern that had always characterized his view of my financial capabilities. Even now, when I clearly managed to improve my situation, his first instinct was to question my judgment. I'm managing just fine, I said coolly. Well, I'm glad you're okay. Listen, the reason I called. Mila and I are actually looking at places in that area ourselves. Maybe we could get together for dinner sometime soon. My stomach dropped. Eleanor's gossip suddenly made terrible sense. The young couple trying to get into the Harrison building. It had to be them. That would be nice, I heard myself saying. Let me know when you have time. After we hung up, I sat in my car feeling the weight of irony settling around me like a heavy coat. Thomas was trying to move to Riverside, the same area he'd probably assumed I could never afford. The same son who'd been ashamed of my rented apartment was now pursuing the kind of lifestyle I'd already achieved. Driving back to my penthouse that night, past the glittering lights of my adopted neighborhood, I wondered what would happen when Thomas discovered the truth. Would he be proud of my success, or would he find some new way to diminish it? More importantly, I wondered if I was ready to let him back into my life, now that I finally had one worth sharing. The answer, I realized, would depend entirely on whether he'd learned to see me as more than just his disappointing mother. Whether he'd learned to see me as Martha, a woman deserving of respect, capable of surprising even herself. But for now, I was content to keep my secret a little longer, to enjoy the peace of my beautiful home, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that sometimes, the people who underestimate us are in for the biggest surprises of all. The knock on my door came on a Tuesday morning, just as I was finishing my coffee and reading the newspaper on my terrace. The morning light streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting everything in a golden glow that still felt surreal after 4 months of living here. Carlos, the concierge, had called up to announce a visitor, but something in his voice suggested he was as surprised as I was. There's a young woman here to see you, Mrs. Patterson. She says she's family. My heart lurched. Only one person would announce herself that way without giving her name first. I told Carlos to send her up, then spent the next few minutes trying to compose myself. What was Mila doing here? How had she gotten my address? When I opened the door, my daughter-in-law stood there with her mouth slightly agape, her perfectly styled blonde hair catching the light from the hallway's crystal chandelier. She was dressed in what I recognized as her serious business outfit, a tailored navy suit that probably cost more than I used to spend on clothes in 6 months. Martha, she breathed, stepping into my foyer uninvited. Her eyes immediately began cataloging everything around her, the marble floors, the original oil paintings Isabella had helped me select, the custom millwork that framed the entrance to my living room. This is incredible. I closed the door behind her, my pulse quickening. Hello, Mila. This is unexpected. She was still staring, turning in a slow circle to take in the space. Through the archway she could see into my living room with its stunning river views, the designer furniture, the carefully curated art collection. Everything about her expression told me she was recalculating everything she thought she knew about me. How did you find my address? I asked, keeping my voice calm. I hired a private investigator, she said absently, still gawking at my home. Thomas was worried when you wouldn't tell us where you were living. We thought maybe you were in some kind of trouble, or living in an unsafe area. The casual mention of a private investigator sent a chill down my spine, but I kept my expression neutral. As you can see, I'm perfectly safe. Mila finally focused on me, her blue eyes sharp with calculation. Martha, I don't understand. How can you afford this place? The Riverside Gardens building is one of the most exclusive addresses in the city. The monthly maintenance fees alone must be $15,000. $12,000 actually, but I wasn't about to correct her. I manage my finances carefully. She laughed, but it wasn't her usual condescending giggle. This laugh had an edge of hysteria. Manage your finances? Martha, you were living in a $600 a month apartment 3 months ago. This place. She gestured wildly around her. This place has to cost at least $8,000 a month to rent. Where did you get that kind of money? I walked into my living room, forcing her to follow me. The morning sun painted everything in warm hues, and I took a moment to appreciate the view that still took my breath away every day. Would you like some coffee? I don't want coffee, Mila snapped, her composure finally cracking. I want answers. Did you take out some kind of dangerous loan? Are you involved in something illegal? Because Thomas is going to be held responsible if you've gotten yourself into financial trouble. The accusation stung, but it also revealed everything I needed to know about how she still saw me. Even faced with evidence of my obvious prosperity, her first assumption was that I must have done something desperate or criminal. The idea that I might have legitimately achieved this lifestyle was apparently inconceivable to her. I'm not in any trouble, Mila, I said quietly. Quite the opposite. She was walking around my living room now, examining everything like a detective gathering evidence. She picked up a crystal vase that Isabella had insisted was absolutely essential for the space, turning it over to look for price tags or identifying marks. This furniture is brand new, she muttered. High-end stuff. That sofa alone probably cost $20,000. She set down the vase and turned to face me. Martha, I need you to be honest with me. How are you paying for all this? Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and her face lit up with sudden excitement. Oh my God, that's perfect timing. Thomas, you need to get over here right now. She was already speaking into the phone. Yes, I found her. You're not going to believe this place. It's like a palace. She hung up and looked at me with something approaching respect for the first time since I'd known her. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Martha, we need to talk about this place because... She paused, took a deep breath, and smiled the kind of smile a shark might give to a particularly plump fish. Because this building is perfect for us. Perfect for you? I repeated carefully. Thomas and I have been looking for a place in Riverside for months. The waiting lists are impossible, and the application processes are so rigorous. But if you're already living here, and if you have some kind of connection to the management... She clasped her hands together like a child asking for a favor. Could you put in a good word for us? Maybe help us skip the line. The audacity of it took my breath away. She just spent 10 minutes interrogating me about my finances, implying I might be a criminal, and now she wanted me to use my connections to help them. But there was something else in her request that made my blood run cold. Mila, I said slowly, exactly what kind of place are you looking for? Well, ideally something in this building would be amazing, but I know that's probably impossible. The units here almost never come available. She walked to my windows, gazing out at the view with naked longing. But even something in the neighborhood would be incredible. We've been trying to get into the Harrison building for months, but they keep saying the waiting list is full. I felt something shift inside my chest, a puzzle piece clicking into place. The Harrison building? It's this gorgeous pre-war building on Elm Street. Thomas found it online, and we both fell in love with it immediately. The problem is, they're incredibly selective about their tenants. They want all these references and financial documents, and the deposit alone is $50,000. $50,000. I thought about Thomas's casual cruelty at his birthday dinner. His assumption that I was too financially incompetent to ever own property. And here he was apparently struggling to come up with a deposit that was less than 3% of what I'd paid for this entire building. So you've applied to the Harrison building? I asked. Oh yes, we just submitted all our paperwork yesterday. Thomas is confident we'll get approved. His income is really strong, and we have excellent credit. She turned back to me with that calculating smile. But having someone like you, someone who obviously has connections in this neighborhood, put in a good word for us. That could really make the difference. Someone like me. The phrase was rich with irony. 3 months ago, I'd been someone she barely tolerated. Someone whose financial situation embarrassed her husband. Now that she'd seen my home, I'd somehow transformed into someone with connections worth cultivating. The sound of the elevator arriving made us both turn toward the foyer. Moments later, I heard Thomas's voice speaking to Carlos, then his footsteps in the hallway. When he walked through my front door, his reaction was even more dramatic than his wife's had been. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, stopping dead in his tracks. "Mom, what is this place?" For a moment we just stared at each other. My son, who'd spent months making me feel ashamed of my modest circumstances, was standing in my marble foyer looking completely overwhelmed. His expensive suit, the one he'd worn so proudly to his birthday dinner, suddenly looked ordinary against the backdrop of my home. "Hello, Thomas," I said simply. He walked slowly into the living room, his eyes taking in every detail. "This is unbelievable." Mila wasn't exaggerating. "This place is incredible." He turned to me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "How long have you been living here?" 4 months. 4 months. His voice cracked slightly. "But how did you? I mean, where did you get the money for a place like this?" Mila jumped in before I could answer. "That's what I've been trying to figure out. She won't tell me how she's affording it." Thomas was looking at me with something approaching awe, but underneath it, I could see the same suspicious concern that had colored his voice during our phone call. Even now, surrounded by evidence of my success, he couldn't quite bring himself to believe I'd achieved it legitimately. "Mom," he said carefully, "you know you can tell us anything, right? If you're in some kind of situation, if someone's helping you or if you've borrowed money you can't pay back." There it was again. The assumption that I must have done something desperate or foolish. The idea that I might have simply inherited enough money to buy this place outright was apparently beyond his imagination. But before I could respond, Mila dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "Thomas, forget about that for now," she said, grabbing his arm excitedly. "This building is perfect for us. If Martha can help us get a unit here, we wouldn't need to worry about the Harrison building anymore. Can you imagine living in a place like this?" She swept her arm toward the windows, encompassing the view, the luxury, the prestige of it all. "We could have dinner parties here, entertain clients. This is exactly the kind of address that would really establish us in the city." Thomas nodded slowly, his eyes still roaming over my living room. "It would be amazing," he agreed. "Mom, do you think there's any way?" He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. They wanted to live here. In my building. The same building I'd bought with money my husband had left me. Money that existed because of sacrifices they'd never known about, because of a love story they'd never understood. The irony was so perfect it almost made me laugh. Instead, I smiled and said the words that would change everything between us. "Actually, there might be something I can do to help you." The excitement in their eyes was almost painful to watch. Thomas and Mila sat on my expensive sofa like children on Christmas morning, hanging on my every word as I explained that I might be able to help them secure an apartment in the building. What they didn't know was that I was about to give them the most valuable lesson of their lives. "So you really think you can make it happen?" Mila asked, leaning forward eagerly. "I mean, do you know someone on the board or in management?" I smiled, choosing my words carefully. "You could say I have some influence with the decision makers." Thomas shook his head in amazement. "Mom, I have to admit I'm impressed. When you said you'd moved to Riverside, I was worried you were getting in over your head financially. But this," he gestured around the room, "this is incredible. You've really figured things out." The condescension was still there, buried under his amazement. Even now, he was framing my success as something surprising, as if he'd expected me to fail. But there was also something else in his voice, a new respect that I'd never heard before. "The thing is," I said, settling back in my chair, "there's actually a unit that just became available. A beautiful 2-bedroom on the 8th floor with river views. The tenant moved out last week." Mila gasped. "Really? Oh my God, that's perfect timing. What's the rent?" "Well, that's where things get interesting," I said. "The unit typically rents for $8,500 a month, plus the maintenance fee of $1,200. But since you're family, I might be able to arrange something more reasonable." Thomas nearly choked on his coffee. $8,500? Jesus, Mom, that's more than we were planning to spend. We were hoping for something in the 6,000 range. I raised an eyebrow. For Riverside? Thomas, you're not going to find anything decent in this neighborhood for 6,000 a month. The Harrison building you've been trying to get into charges at least 7,000 for their smaller units. But we thought maybe with your connections. Mila's voice trailed off as reality began to set in. Let me make some calls, I said, standing up. Why don't you two look around the building? Check out the amenities, get a feel for the place. I'll see what I can arrange. They nodded eagerly and headed for the door. As soon as they were gone, I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat down to think. The moment of truth was approaching, and I needed to decide exactly how I wanted to handle it. Part of me was tempted to simply tell them the truth, that I owned the building, that I could give them any unit they wanted, that their poor mother was actually wealthier than they'd ever imagined. But something held me back. Maybe it was the memory of Thomas's cruel laughter at Romano's, or maybe it was the way they'd immediately assumed I must be involved in something shady to afford my lifestyle. No, they needed to learn something first. They needed to understand what it felt like to be judged by their financial circumstances. They needed to experience what I've been experiencing for years. The anxiety of not quite measuring up, the fear of being found wanting. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. It was Margaret Chun from Pinnacle Property Management. Mrs. Patterson, I hope you don't mind me calling directly. We've had an interesting development with the Harrison building. My pulse quickened. Oh, that young couple I mentioned last week. The ones who've been so persistent about getting an apartment there? They submitted their application yesterday, and I'm afraid it's been rejected. Rejected? I tried to keep my voice neutral. Yes, their debt-to-income ratio was higher than our standards allow. The husband has some significant student loan debt, and they're carrying balances on several credit cards. Combined with their other expenses, they simply don't qualify for our $8,000 units. I closed my eyes, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Thomas and Mila had been rejected from the Harrison building, the place they'd been so confident they'd be accepted. They were living beyond their means, trying to project an image of success they couldn't actually afford. However, Margaret continued, they've now submitted an application for your building. I wanted to check with you before we processed it, since you mentioned wanting to be involved in tenant selection. They applied to my building? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Yes, just this morning. They're asking for the 2-bedroom unit on the 8th floor. I have to say, Mrs. Patterson, their application is problematic. Their income is sufficient for maybe a $5,000 unit, but they're applying for one that costs $8,500 plus maintenance. It's the same issue they had at Harrison. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. They'd applied while I was making coffee, probably using my building's business center. They'd filled out forms claiming they could afford nearly $10,000 a month in housing costs when they just told me they were hoping for something in the 6,000 range. Are they listing any guarantors or additional income sources? I asked. No, just the husband's salary from his marketing position. Mrs. Patterson, I have to recommend we reject this application. They're clearly not qualified for our price range. I stared out my window at the river, watching a boat drift slowly downstream. Thomas and Mila were somewhere in my building right now, probably touring the fitness center or the rooftop garden, imagining themselves living here. They had no idea that their application was already being flagged as insufficient. Margaret, I said finally, I'd like you to approve their application. Mrs. Patterson, are you sure? They really don't meet our financial criteria. I'm sure. But I want the lease structured as month to month, with a 60-day termination clause that can be triggered by either party. There was a pause. That's unusual for our building. Most of our leases are annual commitments. I understand, but these are special circumstances. Can you arrange it? Of course. You're the owner. But may I ask why you want to approve an application from tenants who clearly can't afford the unit? I thought about how to answer that. How do you explain to someone that you're about to teach your own family a lesson about respect? That sometimes the people who hurt you need to experience their own vulnerability before they can understand yours? Let's just say I have my reasons, I said finally. Very well. I'll prepare the lease documents. When would you like them to move in? As soon as possible. And Margaret? I'd prefer to handle the lease signing personally. After I hung up, I sat in my chair for a long time, thinking about what I was about to do. In a few hours, I would offer Thomas and Mila their dream apartment in my building. They would sign a lease they couldn't actually afford, believing they'd gotten a special deal through my connections. And then, when they inevitably struggled to make the payments, I would have a conversation with them about financial responsibility. The irony was perfect. The same son who'd mocked my financial struggles would soon be experiencing his own. The same daughter-in-law who'd questioned my money management would soon be facing the reality of living beyond her means. When they returned an hour later, they were practically glowing with excitement. "Mom, this place is incredible," Thomas said, collapsing onto my sofa. "The fitness center has equipment I've never even seen before. And the rooftop garden? It's like something out of a magazine." "The other residents seem so sophisticated," Mila added. "We met this woman in the elevator who mentioned she's married to a federal judge. Can you imagine the networking opportunities here?" I smiled at their enthusiasm. "Well, I have good news. I spoke to the management company, and they're willing to work with you on the 8th floor unit." "Really?" Mila squealed. "What did they say?" "They can offer it to you for $7,000 a month, plus the maintenance fee. That's $1,500 off the usual rate." Thomas frowned. $7,000 is still more than we wanted to spend, but it's Riverside Gardens," Mila interrupted. "Thomas, this is worth stretching for. This address alone will change how people see us." I watched them debate, seeing the exact moment when their desire for status overwhelmed their financial sense. It was the same impulse that had driven them to eat at Romano's, to lease cars they couldn't quite afford, to live a lifestyle that required them to be constantly worried about money. "We'll take it," Thomas said finally. "When can we sign the lease?" "I can arrange for you to sign the papers tomorrow," I said. "But there's one thing I should mention. The lease will be month to month initially, just until you're sure you want to commit long term." "Month to month is perfect," Mila said quickly. "That gives us flexibility." What it really gave them was rope to hang themselves with, but I didn't say that. Instead, I smiled and congratulated them on their new home. As they left that evening, chattering excitedly about paint colors and furniture arrangements, I felt a strange mixture of anticipation and sadness. In 30 days, when their first rent payment was due, they would discover what it really meant to live beyond your means. They would experience the anxiety that had defined my life for years, the constant worry about making ends meet. But more than that, they would learn that their poor mother had been the one with the power all along. That the woman they dismissed and diminished was actually the person who controlled their fate. I picked up my phone and dialed Margaret's number. "Margaret, it's Martha Patterson. About that lease we discussed." "Yes, Mrs. Patterson. I want you to prepare a 60-day termination notice as well. I have a feeling we're going to need it." 2 months passed in blessed silence. I settled into a rhythm that felt natural for the first time in years: morning coffee on my terrace while reading the financial pages, afternoon walks through Riverside's tree-lined streets, evening dinners with my new friends from the community association. Eleanor Whitman and I had become particularly close, bonding over our shared love of classic literature and our similar experiences of starting over later in life. "You have a piece about you," she told me one Thursday as we sat in my living room discussing the book club's latest selection. "When you first moved here, you seemed like someone carrying a heavy burden. Now you look liberated." She was right. The weight I'd carried for so long, the weight of disappointing my son, of never being enough, of constantly apologizing for my existence, had lifted completely. I wasn't angry anymore, wasn't hurt. I was simply done with allowing other people's judgment to define my worth. The building management reports that Margaret delivered monthly showed that my investment was performing beautifully. Property values in Riverside continued to climb. My tenant retention rate was 100%. And the waiting list for apartments had grown to over 60 families. The financial security Robert had given me was multiplying, but more than that, I was finally understanding what he tried to tell me in his letter, that I deserved to be treated with dignity. On a crisp October morning, as I was reviewing maintenance schedules with Margaret in my dining room, Carlos called up from the lobby. "Mrs. Patterson, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says his name is Thomas." I felt my stomach tighten, but my voice remained steady. "Ask him to wait in the lobby. I'll be down in a few minutes." Margaret gathered her files discreetly. Shall I reschedule our remaining items? No need, I said. This won't take long. I took my time getting ready, choosing my words carefully as I applied lipstick and checked my appearance in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd sat in shame at Romano's restaurant. This woman had clear eyes, straight shoulders, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own value. When I stepped off the elevator into the marble lobby, Thomas was sitting in one of the leather chairs near the windows, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked older than when I'd last seen him, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes. Hello, Thomas. He stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. Mom, thank you for seeing me. I gestured toward the seating area, and we sat across from each other like strangers negotiating a business deal. The distance felt appropriate. You look well, he said, and I could hear the genuine surprise in his voice. This place suits you. Thank you. How have you been? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was nervous. Honestly, not great. Mila and we've been having some problems. I waited for him to continue, offering neither sympathy nor judgment. We couldn't get the apartment at the Harrison building, he said finally. Turns out they were serious about that additional deposit. We ended up having to settle for a place in Midtown. It's nice, but it's not. He gestured around the elegant lobby. It's not this. I'm sure it's perfectly adequate, I said neutrally. Mom, I came here to apologize. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing them. What I said at my birthday dinner, the way I treated you, the assumptions I made about your finances. None of it was okay. I studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. What changed your mind? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Mila left me. That I hadn't expected. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He looked up at me with a bitter smile. She said I was just like my mother. Financially irresponsible, never able to live up to my potential. Turns out that when she married me, she thought I came with a trust fund or family money. When she realized that what you see is what you get, that I'm just a marketing manager with a decent salary and no wealthy parents to fall back on. He shrugged. She decided she could do better. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Mila had left him for the same financial limitations she'd once mocked me for having. But I found no satisfaction in his pain. That must have been difficult, I said. The worst part is that she was right about one thing. I am like you. I work hard, I try to do the right thing, but I'm not wealthy. I'm not impressive. I'm just ordinary. He looked up at me. But you know what I realized? There's nothing wrong with being ordinary. There's nothing shameful about working for what you have. This was the conversation I'd hoped for. The recognition I'd waited years to hear. But now that it was happening, I felt only sadness for the time we'd lost. Your father worked at a hardware store for 30 years, I said quietly. He was never ashamed of honest work. I know. And I was an idiot for ever thinking less of you because of money. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. Mom, I want you to know that even before I found out about Dad's inheritance, I'd started to realize how wrong I was. Losing Mila, having to scramble for an apartment I could actually afford, watching my friends move on to bigger and better things while I stayed in the same job. It gave me perspective. What kind of perspective? That the most important things aren't about money. That the people who love you shouldn't make you feel ashamed of who you are. His voice broke slightly. That I lost the most important relationship in my life because I was too proud and too stupid to appreciate what I had. I felt something shift in my chest, a loosening of tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Thomas, I said gently, what do you want from me? A chance, he said immediately. A chance to be your son again. Not your successful son, not your impressive son, just your son. The one who used to help you plant flowers in the little garden by your old building. The one who called you every Sunday until I got too busy being important. The memory of those Sunday calls hit me unexpectedly. They'd been a ritual for years after he'd moved out, until gradually they'd become shorter, less frequent, eventually stopping altogether as his life grew busier and my place in it grew smaller. And what would that look like? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. I was hoping you could tell me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I know I can't undo the things I said. But if you're willing to give me a chance to prove that I've learned something from all this. I stood up and walked to the lobby windows, looking out at the street where autumn leaves were beginning to fall. Thomas waited silently behind me, not pushing, not demanding, just hoping. I never wanted your money, I said finally. I never wanted you to be impressed by what I could afford. I just wanted you to be proud that I was your mother. I am proud, he said quietly. I was always proud. I was just too insecure about my own life to show it properly. When I turned around, there were tears in his eyes. Your father left me more than money, I told him. He left me the understanding that I deserved to be treated with respect. That includes by my own family. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about the building or the inheritance or any of the material things. This is about basic human dignity. About not making someone you love feel small because it makes you feel bigger. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I get it. I really do. I studied his face for a long moment, then made my decision. Sunday dinners, I said. Every week. In my apartment. You'll help me cook, and we'll talk about real things. Not your job or my building or anyone's financial situation. Just life. His face lit up with something I hadn't seen since he was a child. Really? And Thomas? If you ever make me feel ashamed of myself again, that will be the end of it. No second chances, no explanations. Do you understand? Yes. Absolutely. The building management reports that Margaret delivered monthly showed that my investment was performing beautifully. Property values in Riverside continued to climb. My tenant retention rate was 100%. And the waiting list for apartments had grown to over 60 families. The financial security Robert had given me was multiplying, but more than that, I was finally understanding what he tried to tell me in his letter, that I deserved to be treated with dignity. On a crisp October morning, as I was reviewing maintenance schedules with Margaret in my dining room, Carlos called up from the lobby. Mrs. Patterson, there's a gentleman here to see you. He says his name is Thomas. I felt my stomach tighten, but my voice remained steady. Ask him to wait in the lobby. I'll be down in a few minutes. Margaret gathered her files discreetly. Shall I reschedule our remaining items? No need, I said. This won't take long. I took my time getting ready, choosing my words carefully as I applied lipstick and checked my appearance in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was different from the one who'd sat in shame at Romano's restaurant. This woman had clear eyes, straight shoulders, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your own value. When I stepped off the elevator into the marble lobby, Thomas was sitting in one of the leather chairs near the windows, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He looked older than when I'd last seen him, tired in a way that went beyond physical exhaustion. His expensive suit was wrinkled, and there were shadows under his eyes. Hello, Thomas. He stood up quickly, almost knocking over his chair. Mom, thank you for seeing me. I gestured toward the seating area, and we sat across from each other like strangers negotiating a business deal. The distance felt appropriate. You look well, he said, and I could hear the genuine surprise in his voice. This place suits you. Thank you. How have you been? He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was nervous. Honestly, not great. Mila and we've been having some problems. I waited for him to continue, offering neither sympathy nor judgment. We couldn't get the apartment at the Harrison building, he said finally. Turns out they were serious about that additional deposit. We ended up having to settle for a place in Midtown. It's nice, but it's not. He gestured around the elegant lobby. It's not this. I'm sure it's perfectly adequate, I said neutrally. Mom, I came here to apologize. The words came out in a rush, as if he'd been rehearsing them. What I said at my birthday dinner, the way I treated you, the assumptions I made about your finances. None of it was okay. I studied his face, looking for signs of sincerity. What changed your mind? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. Mila left me. That I hadn't expected. I'm sorry to hear that. Are you? He looked up at me with a bitter smile. She said I was just like my mother. Financially irresponsible, never able to live up to my potential. Turns out that when she married me, she thought I came with a trust fund or family money. When she realized that what you see is what you get, that I'm just a marketing manager with a decent salary and no wealthy parents to fall back on. He shrugged. She decided she could do better. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with a knife. Mila had left him for the same financial limitations she'd once mocked me for having. But I found no satisfaction in his pain. That must have been difficult, I said. The worst part is that she was right about one thing. I am like you. I work hard, I try to do the right thing, but I'm not wealthy. I'm not impressive. I'm just ordinary. He looked up at me. But you know what I realized? There's nothing wrong with being ordinary. There's nothing shameful about working for what you have. This was the conversation I'd hoped for. The recognition I'd waited years to hear. But now that it was happening, I felt only sadness for the time we'd lost. Your father worked at a hardware store for 30 years, I said quietly. He was never ashamed of honest work. I know. And I was an idiot for ever thinking less of you because of money. Thomas leaned forward in his chair. Mom, I want you to know that even before I found out about Dad's inheritance, I'd started to realize how wrong I was. Losing Mila, having to scramble for an apartment I could actually afford, watching my friends move on to bigger and better things while I stayed in the same job. It gave me perspective. What kind of perspective? That the most important things aren't about money. That the people who love you shouldn't make you feel ashamed of who you are. His voice broke slightly. That I lost the most important relationship in my life because I was too proud and too stupid to appreciate what I had. I felt something shift in my chest. A loosening of tension I'd carried for so long I'd forgotten it was there. Thomas, I said gently, what do you want from me? A chance, he said immediately. A chance to be your son again. Not your successful son, not your impressive son, just your son. The one who used to help you plant flowers in the little garden by your old building. The one who called you every Sunday until I got too busy being important. The memory of those Sunday calls hit me unexpectedly. They'd been a ritual for years after he'd moved out, until gradually they'd become shorter, less frequent, eventually stopping altogether as his life grew busier and my place in it grew smaller. And what would that look like? I asked. I don't know, he admitted. I was hoping you could tell me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I know I can't undo the things I said. But if you're willing to give me a chance to prove that I've learned something from all this. I stood up and walked to the lobby windows, looking out at the street where autumn leaves were beginning to fall. Thomas waited silently behind me, not pushing, not demanding, just hoping. I never wanted your money, I said finally. I never wanted you to be impressed by what I could afford. I just wanted you to be proud that I was your mother. I am proud, he said quietly. I was always proud. I was just too insecure about my own life to show it properly. When I turned around, there were tears in his eyes. Your father left me more than money, I told him. He left me the understanding that I deserved to be treated with respect. That includes by my own family. I understand. Do you? Because this isn't about the building or the inheritance or any of the material things. This is about basic human dignity. About not making someone you love feel small because it makes you feel bigger. Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. I get it. I really do. I studied his face for a long moment, then made my decision. Sunday dinners, I said. Every week. In my apartment. You'll help me cook, and we'll talk about real things. Not your job or my building or anyone's financial situation. Just life. His face lit up with something I hadn't seen since he was a child. Really? And Thomas? If you ever make me feel ashamed of myself again, that will be the end of it. No second chances, no explanations. Do you understand? Yes. Absolutely. I walked back to where he sat and for the first time in months opened my arms to him. He stood and hugged me, and for a moment he was just my little boy again. The one who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. I missed you, Mom, he whispered. I missed you too. When we pulled apart, I saw Carlos watching from his desk with a small smile. He'd probably witnessed dozens of family dramas in this lobby over the years, but something about our reunion seemed to please him. "So," Thomas said, wiping his eyes and trying to recover his composure. "Sunday dinners. Should I bring anything?" "Just yourself," I said. "And maybe an appetite for my pot roast. I finally perfected the recipe." He laughed, and it sounded genuine for the first time in years. "I remember that pot roast. You've been working on it since I was 10. Some things are worth taking time to get right," I said, and we both understood I wasn't just talking about cooking. As I watched him leave, walking out into the autumn afternoon with lighter steps than when he'd arrived, I felt the last piece of my new life click into place. Robert had given me financial security, but more importantly, he'd given me the courage to demand the respect I deserved. And now finally I was getting it. That evening, as I sat on my terrace watching the sunset paint the river in shades of gold and pink, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. From a woman who apologized for taking up space to someone who owned the most beautiful building in the city. From a mother who begged for scraps of affection to one who could set boundaries and watch them be respected. The phone rang and I smiled when I saw Eleanor's name. "How did it go with your son?" she asked without preamble. "Better than I expected," I said. "We're going to try again." "I'm glad. Family is complicated, but when it works, it's worth the effort." After we hung up, I stayed on the terrace until the stars came out, feeling grateful for all of it. The money that had given me choices, the home that reflected my worth, the friends who saw my value, and now the son who was finally learning to see it too. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new opportunities to choose dignity over desperation. But tonight, I was simply a woman sitting in her beautiful home, surrounded by the life she'd built and the respect she'd earned. It had taken 64 years, but I'd finally learned the most important lesson of all. That love without respect is just another word for settling. And I was done settling for anything less than I deserved.